This whole rant is said from the perspective, you can hear it all over it, that like Russia isn't a colonizer. Russia isn't an imperial power. Russia isn't a slaver. Russia didn't do all these horrible things Europe and America did. That's what makes us better. I need to talk to you guys about this Medvedev schizo rant. I saw people in chat immediately telling me about it. Like, hey, dude, I read it. I tweeted about it, as you can see. But let's just go through it. Let's read it. For those of you who don't know who Dmitry Medvedev is, Dmitry Medvedev is a Russian government official. He is the former president of Russia. He was kind of used in a weird kind of chess piece way where he became president of Russia. He replaced Putin. And then once he was done being president after his one term, he then gave the reins of power back over to Putin. He basically was like a filler president in order to fill the gap between Putin's terms in power, since Putin could not technically at the time constitutionally have another term. So he had to dip out for a little bit until they, shimmied and shake the system for Putin to go back into power. And so that was the role he fulfilled in Putin's government. He's been with Putin since the campaign trail. I watched this fantastic documentary by DW on Putin on the campaign trail, and if you look around the room, there's like a million different people who have been who have either fled the country because they got on the wrong side of the Russian government, who are dead because they either got disease or something else, or they've completely kind of like left politics. But this guy, he's still there. He's been with Putin for well over 20 years now. He's been with Putin even before he was president. And so the kind of the words he puts out there has weight. Now, a lot of people also acknowledge the fact that as of the last few years, since he's no longer been president, his rants and commentary online have gotten more and more schizoposty as he started to look more and more like Tsar Nicholas, actually. Can we look at a more recent picture of Dmitry Medvedev? Do we have any more recent pictures of him? No, it's all older pictures of him. Oh no, we don't have any of the newer pictures of him. If you look at a newer picture of him, is this him? Yeah, here it is actually. This is Medvedev. This is what Medvedev looks like now. It's weird because he just kind of looks like, Tsar Nicholas. He looks like the Romanov. He looks like he came straight out of the Romanovs now. I don't know if this is on purpose, that he's trying to look like the Romanovs for political weight or style. But it's uncanny, unironically, man. He looks like he came straight out of the family dynasty. But we're not talking about him because of the LARPing as a Russian monarch. We're talking about him because of a schizo post he released. Look how long this is. Look how long this is. Anyway, we gotta read it, because his words carry weight. People pay attention to what he says, even if he doesn't have the same amount of influence he used to. He still has Putin's ear, still a close Putin ally, and still somebody who can garner a large audience within Russia. And something I want you to notice here is that this tweet is in English. This isn't in Russian. It's been seen by English speakers, over 4.5 million English speakers in the West since it was posted today. This was a message meant for a Western audience. And something that you guys should know by now, if you've been paying attention to my channel for long enough, is that the Russian state media, the stuff they put out, is really, 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 really xenophobic. It's really bad. It's a lot of times filled with misinformation. It's a lot of times just like blatantly lying to you. But it is designed for a Russian audience and not designed for an English-speaking audience. So when it gets super Russian nationalistic, when it gets really xenophobic towards Ukrainians, when they start dropping slurs, when they start talking about the need to like maybe kill a few more civilians, displace more people, make the Ukrainian people suffer so they can get rid of their self-hating Russian identity and bring them back into the fold of Mother Russia and free them from themselves. When we see that rhetoric, it's only in Russian state media meant for a Russian audience. It's not in RT America, because that type of message would horrify an American audience, and it's not meant for an American audience. And so that's why this message right here is so interesting, is because this is a message that is of that theme that's usually meant for a Russian audience that now is starting to slip more and more slowly into an English-speaking audience, into the international audience. He has taken a message that would usually would be too xenophobic for the international audience, and he gave it to him anyway.
A curd is a curd.
Bamazrad has donated $5. What's your favorite Passover food item? Also, did you do Chad Gadya? Will prob be mispronounced by TTS?
I don't know if there was anything I really liked. I ate some like leaves and stuff, and I didn't really enjoy that. I guess I don't know. I remember we ate some like nuts. I like the nuts, I guess. The whole the tradition of the dinner was cool. Of the Seder dinner was cool, but there wasn't like a food that particularly connected with me. I liked afterwards when we could drink as much. I guess my favorite item would be the wine. That was probably my favorite item of the whole event. Dylan loves nuts. Haha. Yes, you got it. Okay. Anyway, let's read the Dmitry Medvedev schizo post. Let's get through this thing because it's pretty bad. Here's the line he starts with. Here's his header for the tweet. Why will Ukraine disappear? Because nobody needs it. So right off the bat, his premise is Ukraine will disappear. He says it as a fact, as in not, oh, maybe one day it will disappear. He says like it will. By the will of Russia, it will disappear. Ukraine will disappear. And the reason he gives for wiping the nation off the face of the earth is because nobody needs it. You know, I find it interesting that nobody needs it, because if nobody needs it, it's really weird how fiercely the people of Ukraine are fighting to defend it, almost like they feel like they do need it. Because if they don't have it, maybe they're going to get the quote-unquote cleansing operations done to them, like the Russians did in the Kiev Oblast when they were trying to take Kiev, going door to door, taking anybody associated with government officials, anybody associated with the military, giving them a quick interrogation, shooting them in the head, moving on to the next house, right? I think a lot of people probably don't want that. And also, you know, self-determination. And so they're fighting pretty fiercely. So if nobody needs it, it's weird that, you know, the international community is sending so much aid and Ukrainians are fighting so fiercely. I don't know why somebody would fight tooth and nail and put their life on the line for something they don't need. Let's go through his points, though. I want to say, number one, Europe doesn't need Ukraine. The forced support of the Nazi regime by the American mentor's order has put Europeans into a financial and political inferno, all for the sake of Bandera's Unter Ukraine, that even the snobby, insolent Polacks, that doesn't sound very good. That sounds a little racist, doesn't it? Don't take for a valid country, and time again, toss in the issue of its western area Anschluss. This is a reference to German annexation for like living space and stuff like that. The Anschluss of like Austria, stuff like that. There's a nice perspective ahead to permanently put the Novio Ukraine blood-sucking parasites on the decrepit EU arthritis crippled neck. That'll be the final fall of Europe, once majestic, but robbed by degeneration. Okay, so let's talk about this first paragraph. So this first paragraph is using some language that, I would be honest, sounds pretty genocidal, and I could call it genocidal language. When he's using terms like, I mean, Polacks is one thing, right? But the words that I'm really scared of here is the Ukrainian blood-sucking parasites, right? Might as well just be calling them insects. Might as well be just calling them subhuman Ukrainian blood-sucking parasites. Remember, this is the former president of Russia. This would be like if Obama started saying like the Mexican blood-sucking parasites, right? That's the type of language that you start to hear and you start getting worried about what is the government's intentions. Why is he trying to put out messages that are so dehumanizing? And I mean, the premise here is pretty easy, kind of, you know, led with his premise. He's being this way, he's acting this way, he's trying to bring down the humanity of Ukrainians in this way because he wants to justify abolishing the Ukrainian nation state. If Ukrainians are less than human, if Ukrainians are blood-sucking parasites, if Ukrainians are all Nazis and Banderites and all these evil things, right, that are being propped up by, you know, the Western dogs, then whatever you do to deal with them, it's whatever, because they're dogs, they're parasites, right? How do you deal with parasites? You remove the parasites. And so that's why I feel that this is genocidal societal language, right? If we heard anybody else refer to Jews or black people or Asians or any other group as parasites, we would quickly identify that as, wow, that sounds like Nazi propaganda. And that's the thing that's interesting about this first part, is he's calling them Banderites, he's calling them a Nazi state, before then moving on to use the word Polak, before transitioning to calling a group of people that have historically been discriminated against, historically been abused, historically been attacked and had their culture suppressed, and, you know, dehumanizing them through calling them parasites.
Pasta21 has donated $5. This money goes to Danabo's healthcare. Go buy him some pills of that sketchy dude down the blocks to keep him covered, will ya? Less than 3.
That's a good idea. I should pump my editor and / booker, Danabo, full of as much Adderall as possible to keep him on the work grind, okay? We run a tight ship here at Dylan Burns TV, and I keep my employees in line through my sheer will and by hiring the Pinkertons. Next paragraph. The U.S. doesn't need Ukraine. True, the military and sanction campaigns are attempted for PR by political blabbermouths who long ago attested to their impotence and imbecility. Average Americans don't understand what Ukraine is and where it is. Most of them won't show this power on the map on the first take. Why won't the U.S. establishment focus on inflation and job issues or emergencies in their home states instead of a country 404 unbeknownst to them? Why does so much dough go across the ocean? Sooner or later, they'll ask for that. Then, storming of the Capitol in January 2021 would seem like scout games. Okay, so a few things I gotta say here. First thing, they're saying that the average American doesn't know where Ukraine is, doesn't know anything about Ukraine. Most of them can't name it on a map. Why won't the American government care about dealing with inflation and job issues in their own country instead of trying to help another country defend against their invasion? This is interesting to me because you could easily take this logic and reverse it on the Russian government and reverse it on Dmitry Medvedev here and say, okay, well, income inequality in Russia is much greater than in the United States. The standard of living in Russia is lower than in the United States. The amount of civil rights and judicial protections for average citizens, much lower in Russia than in the United States. Press freedom in Russia, practically non-existent. There's a million different issues that they have to deal with in Russia. Alcoholism, major issue affecting all aspects of society, where Russia's going through a demographic crisis and they're losing hundreds of thousands of people to alcohol poisoning. They're losing babies to fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a major issue in Russia. Russia is the home of crocodile. Russia is the home of a ton of domestic abuse. It has a million different issues they could be dealing with in Russia. The Russian ruble right now, as we speak, even with the artificial holding up that the Russian state has done, where they have artificially tried to keep the price of the ruble stable, it is still starting to collapse even with the artificial price controls instituted by the Russian government. We have basic commodity prices going up in Russia, all caused directly by the Russian government through their invasion and through the misappropriation of funds, either through corruption or misappropriating funds for the military. We have a major portion of the Russian economy being spent on the military, more than ever for the entirety of Putin's time in power. For the entirety of his administration, they've never been spending more on the military, all while they're dealing with all of these societal issues that they could be spending that money on instead. And who knows what percentage of that money is being siphoned off anyway by corrupt government officials, which Russia is awash in. So, I don't know. I feel like you could pretty easily turn this issue back on the Russians here. Sorry, somebody just invited me to play Counter-Strike. Don't know why. The other thing that's interesting here is he directly mentions the storming of the Capitol in January 6th. Now, as I don't know how many of you are outside of the United States or how many of you talk to people outside of the United States often, but something that I've noticed since being out of the United States and talking to a lot of people outside of the United States is how humiliating January 6th was for the United States. How for a lot of authoritarian regimes, for a lot of autocracies, they could point to January 6th and say, see, democracy doesn't work. You know, the guy lost, couldn't accept it, created all these theories, people stormed the Capitol, tried to stop him from leaving power. See, democracy's flawed. Then they turn to their people and say, see the type of chaos democracy brings? We bring stability. We bring strength. And so here's the mentioning of January 6th, a low point for the United States, trying to kind of like, you know, throw in a low blow during the schizo rant. Third chapter, Africa and Latin America don't need Ukraine. The hundreds of millions spent by the United States on pointly fights in Ukraine could finance many development programs for Latin America and African states. Latin America is gringo's backyard. That's what they've been rubbing in for decades. Africa had its share of suffering from genocide and colonial dependence imposed by former Western slave traders. That's why the people of Africa, African huts and Latin American fevals ask a very reasonable question. For their former suffering and present-day loyalty, why is someone else rewarded? Very, very far away. So this is interesting to me because they open up saying that you know, Africa and Latin America doesn't need Ukraine. But one of the main arguments I've heard from not only the Russian government, but other governments out there that want to see the war end immediately, no matter what the cost is when it comes to ceasefire negotiations and peace deal negotiations, Ukraine ceding territory, is that the war has caused price instability across Africa due to the lack of Ukrainian grain that was going to Africa. And this is why Russia and Ukraine, using the intermediary in Turkey, negotiated a grain corridor so the Ukrainian government could export grain and food, since Ukraine is considered like the quote-unquote breadbasket of Europe. So it's weird to have the Russian government go out of its way to negotiate with the Ukrainians to get a grain corridor for Africa to help keep food prices stable, but then also Africa doesn't need Ukraine. The world doesn't need Ukraine. The world does not need the breadbasket. Very interesting. Asia doesn't need Ukraine. This is number 4. Asia doesn't need Ukraine. By Russia's example, they see color technologies at work to eradicate the largest competing powers. They understand what scenarios the American-led collective West has for them if they disobey. Help us to overcome Russia, and we'll soon come to you, the utterly brazen Western leaders tell them. You know, the thing that's interesting about this is like Asia doesn't need Ukraine, but if you hear this, it just sounds like it's kind of directed towards one country. It just kind of sounds like it's directed towards China. Such gigantic countries as India, China, and other Indo-Pacific states face the big enough challenge of post-pandemic economic recovery. Let aside the drugged clowns and their whining for aid. We are not interested in you, Asia tells their messengers, responding to the calls to support Ukraine and confine Russia. The country, I mean, they say that, but then Japan's sending, I think, what, $9.5 billion in aid this year to support Ukraine. And the South Korean government doesn't really know how to respond to artillery shell requests from the American government. May be coming soon, may not be coming soon. We got this from the recent leaks, from the intel leaks from the Joint Chief of Staff briefings that came out a few days ago. We're going to talk about that later in the stream. So, I mean, it depends on the state. Taiwan's very supportive of Ukraine. Other countries in Asia aren't as supportive of Ukraine, or neutral. The country geopolitically many times closer to Asian powers, the one that historically has proven itself a reliable strategic partner. Do Asian giants need such headache coming from former colonizers? The thing that's interesting here is they say, oh, do they need such headaches coming from former colonizers? Russia is a colonizing power. This whole rant is said from the perspective, you can hear it all over it, that like Russia isn't a colonizer. Russia isn't an imperial power. Russia isn't a slaver. Russia didn't do all these horrible things Europe and America did. That's what makes us better. But the truth of the matter is, Russia has engaged in colonialism. Russia has engaged in imperialism, whether it be how it acted in the Caucasus, whether what it did in Chechnya, whether it's what it did in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, whether it's what it's been doing in Ukraine, whether it's its history of oppressing the Baltics in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, whether it's its history, I mean, during the Soviet Union and what the Soviet Union did, whether it's what it did in Central Asia. And I mean, we're talking about Asia here. Are we really going to pretend that Russia hasn't exploited Central Asian resources, that Russia hasn't exploited the Central Asian people? If you look at the death charts in Ukraine for Russian soldiers, if you're from Central Asia, the casualty numbers are just much higher for Central Asian communities, Central Asian fighters on the Russian side. Are we just supposed to ignore that? I mean, we all remember like the war in Vietnam. When we talk about the Black American experience in Vietnam, it is that they died at much higher rates, that they were treated more expendably, that they were not treated with the same respect that white American soldiers were treated, right? This is something that the Soviet Union tried to harp on about. This is something that the Viet Cong talked about constantly. And now we see Russia behaving in a very similar way, if not even to a worse extent, with their Central Asian soldiers, while also lecturing the West about Asia. Okay, continuing. Number 5, Russia doesn't need Ukraine. You know, this is a really interesting sentence here. I feel like this entire thing could have been skipped and we could have gotten to this sentence, because this sentence right here is interesting, because if Russia doesn't need Ukraine, why is Russia invading Ukraine? If Russia doesn't need Ukraine, why is Russia invading Ukraine? That's my central premise, central question here. Doesn't really make much sense. I mean, it's not that they're just invading Ukraine. They have lost like possibly up to like 200,000 in casualties, according to some U.S. intelligence estimates. I mean, over 200,000 casualties, honestly. And they're just throwing all that away for nothing, for something that's useless, something that they don't need. They're threatening nuclear weapons on a regular basis. They're threatening a world-ending event that could annihilate nearly, if not all, life on Earth for something that they don't need. It doesn't really make much sense to me. A fair bear quilt, torn, shaggy, and greasy. The new Malorussia, this means like Little Russian basically, of 1991 is made up of the artificially cut territories, many of which are indigenously Russian, separated by the accident in the 20th century. I like it's that not the creation of the Soviet Union, a regime which was extremely brutal, engaged in ethnic cleansing, killed millions of people, extremely politically repressive, denied many people their self-determination, put down uprising after uprising of people trying to garner for freedom. That wasn't the accident. The accident was the collapse of that. And we're hearing that from people who act as corrupt oligarchs, people who act not in the interest of socialism or communism, because for him, it's not about the socialism or communism when it comes to the Soviet Union. It's about the power the Soviet Union had. That's the end of the day. It's power politics. It's all about the power. Millions of our compatriots live there, harassed for years by the Nazi Kiev regime. It is them who we defend in our special military operation, relentlessly eradicating the enemy. We don't need Unter Ukraine. We need big, great Russia. I like here that we have the Nazi Kiev regime, even though earlier they were calling the Ukrainians parasites, which is, I mean, gonna be honest, Nazi rhetoric. But also, we defend those in Ukraine who are the Malorussians, you know, the little Russians. We defend them, even though Russia is the main killer, the main murderer of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. If you look at the areas of Ukraine that have had the most civilian casualties, they are all Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. It is all in the Kharkiv Oblast, in the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, Zaporozhye Oblast, Kherson Oblast. It's all areas that have high levels of Russian-speaking populations. Leading up to this war, I think in 2021, there were like 9 civilian casualties. 9 civilian casualties from the stalemate situation, from kind of the semi-frozen conflict between Ukraine and Russia. 9 in comparison to the possibly hundreds of thousands that are dying now. Russian speakers, many of them, if not the majority of them, being killed. But they are coming here to protect these people that they're bombing relentlessly. I mean, if you look at Mariupol, the city was flattened. If you look at Bakhmut, the city has been flattened. If you look at many locations all across Ukraine, cities that have literally been wiped off the face of the earth in eastern Ukraine. Popasna is a great example of this. When the Russians captured Popasna after leveling it to the ground, they literally announced, we will not be rebuilding it because there's not a single building in the entire city that can be salvaged. Literally wiping Russian-speaking cities off the face of the earth, but those are the people they're coming to protect. Number 6, finally, its own citizens don't need the Nazi-headed Ukraine. That's why out of 45 million people, there are only 20 million remaining. This is a incredible underestimate. An incredible underestimate. Over 50% of the refugees that left the country have returned to the country, which I think indicates something. Definitely, since a lot of the people, actually no, the vast majority of the people who left are the elderly, children, and women taking care of the elderly and children. People who, in large part, cannot fight, except for, a certain percentage of the women. That's why those who stayed want to leave for any place. Again, there are tons of people here who could leave. We've interviewed Anastasia on the channel before. You can go check that on DylanBurnsTV. Euromaidan protester we interviewed. We interviewed others on the channel before, tons of people on the channel before, who have made the decision to stay in Ukraine and fight, help with aid work, or just live here because they would feel too guilty if they were to leave their nation in its time of need and flee to some other European country. Why did over 50% of the refugees return to Ukraine? If they're so desperate to leave, why didn't they just stay overseas? Doesn't really make much sense to me. That's why those who stayed want to leave for any place. The hated Poland. I like the hated Poland. The hated Poland. EU, NATO, to be America's 51st state. Oh my goodness. Quick poll in chat. Number 1, if you want Ukraine to be the 51st state, if that'd be based and cool. Number 2, if you don't want it. Just, quick poll. Joining the Antarctic with its penguins will also be fine, as long as it's quiet and the food is good. The ruling junta, junta is like a military dictatorship. Criminal ambitions force Ukrainians to beg and roam around countries and continents searching for a better life. This is interesting because it's not the Russian bombs that forced many Ukrainians to flee. It's not the invasion that forced many of them to flee, even though, it's when the invasion happened that all these people fled. It's the government that is trying to keep the invading army that have filled up mass graves across the country. It is them who caused them to flee. All that is for an obscure European perspective, or rather, to let the Harlequin in a khaki tricoat and his band of thievish Nazi clowns to put the money stolen from the West into their offshore's account. None of this has been proven. This is just complete fantasy. Would ordinary Ukrainians need that? Nobody on this planet needs such a Ukraine. That's why it will disappear. So this is his manifesto. I mean, this is the type of thing I would read after seeing somebody shoot up a movie theater, if I'm being completely honest. This is Schizophrenic. I would expect the Buffalo shooter to write this. The Nashville shooter, I wouldn't be surprised if Dmitry Medvedev, stole their manifesto, replaced a few words here or there, and then uploaded them themselves. And this is actually their manifesto that we haven't gotten released yet. This is the type of dialogue that Dmitry Medvedev engages in on the regular. The only reason I'm covering this in particular is because it's all being together in one place and not in separate threads. Just kind of shows how kind of schizo posting it is. It is not only Dmitry Medvedev that engages in this kind of dialogue, calling Ukrainians parasites and the rest of the pretty gross stuff that was said in this schizo post. It is a lot of Russian state media figures like Solonyov or the chief editor at Russia Today, or any other number of media figures and government officials that have pushed forward commentary similar, if not almost identical to this. And so while this, as a Westerner might shock you to see a Russian government official say so openly and to a Western audience that this is not going to communicate with at all, be this open about their bigotry, But this type of dialogue happens all the time. It just usually happens in Russian and on Russian state TV, and it's not usually happening in the Western sphere. That's why this is interesting. The only reason this is interesting, the only other reason besides how the schizo it appears in and of itself, we're reading it. The only reason we're reading it is because it was meant for a Western audience. And the thing that's interesting about it being meant for a Western audience is like you can see things like terms in here like Malorussia. Like Westerners don't know that term. I mean, it's like, I know people talk about like, you know, Joe Biden's like, you know, riddled with dementia and doesn't know what he's doing, but I don't know, man. Dmitry Medvedev's starting to give me some signs.